The first thing Alan Cross noticed was the silence. Not the kind of quiet you'd find in an empty room, but the unnerving stillness that only existed in the vast expanse of Mars. The only sound was the faint hiss of his oxygen regulator as he trudged across the red desert, his boots crunching against the iron-rich soil. Overhead, the sky was a muted salmon hue, the sun smaller and colder than it ever appeared back on Earth. Then he saw it, black smoke curling into the thin atmosphere, an oily smudge against the endless rust-colored horizon. Alan adjusted the visor of his suit, scanning the wreckage with practiced eyes. The remains of the alien shuttle stretched out in a jagged arc, its hull shattered like a discarded toy. Whatever had hit it, it wasn't just a rough landing. Impact craters surrounded the crash site, suggesting a battle or a catastrophic systems failure. Both were bad news. He approached cautiously, his pulse rifle strapped tightly to his back. While Mars wasn't a war zone, the frontier was unpredictable. Pirates, rogue scavengers, even territorial alien species. Alan had seen enough to know that complacency could kill you faster than a bullet. A faint noise made him stop in his tracks. He strained to hear it again over the sound of his own breathing. There, a low, rasping groan, barely audible over the Martian wind. Someone was alive. He quickened his pace, his boots sinking into the loose sand as he reached the wreckage. The hull had split wide open, revealing a tangle of sparking wires and alien machinery. His helmet's visor highlighted faint heat signatures, leading him to the source of the sound. She lay half-buried under a twisted sheet of metal, her body sprawled unnaturally. Alan froze for a moment, his brain catching up to what his eyes were seeing. The alien woman looked otherworldly, even for someone like him who'd seen dozens of species across the galaxy. Her skin was a soft, luminescent violet, shimmering faintly in the Martian light like it was coated in stardust. Long silver hair spilled across her face, matted with streaks of dark, viscous blood. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. One of her arms was pinned beneath the debris, the other clutching at the sand, as if trying to pull herself free. Alan stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "Hey, can you hear me?" he said, crouching down beside her. Her eyes fluttered open. They weren't like human eyes. They swirled with colors, iridescent like liquid galaxies trapped in her skull. For a moment, she stared at him, disoriented but alert. "You human?" she rasped, her voice lilting with a strange but melodic accent. "Yeah," Alan replied. "Hold on, I'm going to get you out of here." "Dishonor," she muttered, barely audible. Her hand slipped from the sand, falling limp. "Hey, no," Alan said sharply, his heart thudding in his chest. "Stay awake. You're not dying on me." He pulled the debris off her with a grunt, tossing it aside. Her body was lighter than he'd expected as he carefully hoisted her onto his shoulder. Either her physiology was fragile, or her injuries had drained her strength. The woman stirred faintly, mumbling words he couldn't understand. Alan ignored the pang of guilt that gnawed at him. She wasn't his responsibility, but he couldn't leave her to die out here. "Hang tight," he muttered, adjusting his grip as he began the long walk back to his shuttle. The Martian terrain was unforgiving. Loose rocks shifted underfoot, and the thin atmosphere offered little resistance to the biting wind. Every step felt like a mile, the alien woman's limp form growing heavier with each passing second. Alan's helmet comm crackled to life as he neared his ship. "Cross, what's your status?" The voice of his AI companion, Vega, was calm but inquisitive. "Found a survivor," Alan replied, breathless. "Alien. Female. Critical condition. Prep the med bay." "Understood. Oxygen compatibility for her species is unknown. Recommend immediate stabilization procedures." "Working on it," Alan said, his jaw tight. He reached the ship, its sleek frame a welcome sight against the endless red sands. The hatch hissed open, and Alan hurried inside, sealing the door behind him. The airlock pressurized with a low hum, and Alan felt the shift as breathable atmosphere flooded the chamber. He laid the woman on the medbay table, her violet skin pale and clammy. Vitals unstable, Vega announced, scanning the woman with the ship's medical systems. Oxygen levels critically low. Biochemical analysis incomplete. Unknown species. Great, Alan muttered, grabbing a portable oxygen injector. Let's hope this doesn't kill her. He fitted the injector to her suit and activated it. A soft hiss followed as oxygen flowed into her system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, her chest rose in a deeper breath, and her skin seemed to regain a faint shimmer. Alan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Why help? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the question carried weight. Alan looked at her, surprised she was conscious enough to ask. Because I could, he said simply. Her iridescent eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. You strange, she murmured before slipping back into unconsciousness. Alan leaned back, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Strange was right. Nothing about this day was normal. He glanced at the medical readouts. She was stable for now, but her condition could deteriorate at any moment. He didn't know who she was or why she'd crashed, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just an accident. The scorch marks on her shuttle, the precision of the damage, it all pointed to an attack. Whatever had happened out there, it wasn't over. Alan's gaze lingered on her face, a mix of determination and unease settling in his chest. He had saved her life, but something told him that might have been the easy part. The alien woman stirred, her body twitching slightly as the medbay lights cast a sterile glow over her shimmering violet skin. Alan Cross sat nearby, arms crossed, watching the medical monitor flash cryptic data he could barely interpret. Her condition had stabilized, but only just. Her breathing, now steady, had replaced the fragile rasp from earlier. Alan let out a slow exhale, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to loosen. He almost didn't notice her eyes flutter open. Those strange, iridescent eyes blinked once, then twice, before locking onto him with a sharp intensity. Where am I? She asked, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that still carried the weight of authority. Alan leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. My ship. You crashed. Found you near what was left of your shuttle. Her gaze flicked around the room, taking in the smooth, utilitarian surfaces of the med bay, the humming diagnostic equipment, and finally Alan himself. She studied him with an unnerving focus, as though memorizing every detail of his face. You saved me? She asked, her words slow and deliberate. Alan nodded. Looked like you could use the help. The woman shifted slightly, wincing as she tried to sit up. Alan moved to steady her, but she flinched away, her expression hardening. I don't require your assistance, she said, though the weakness in her voice betrayed her words. Clearly, Alan replied dryly, stepping back. You seemed pretty self-sufficient when you were bleeding out in the Martian dirt. Her eyes narrowed, but then her shoulders sagged. You're not Zenthari. Why risk your life for mine? Alan raised an eyebrow. Is that what you are? Zenthari? He gestured to her with a small shrug. I wasn't exactly taking a poll out there. You were alive, so I brought you in. That's it. Her gaze softened, though she didn't answer his question. Instead, she leaned back against the medbay wall, her movements careful and measured. Humans, always interfering. Interfering? Alan crossed his arms, his tone shifting. You're welcome, by the way. For a moment, her expression wavered. Then, to his surprise, her lips curved into a faint smile. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Your actions carry consequences, human. Alan tilted his head, bemused. Consequences? For saving your life? Yes. She hesitated, glancing at the medical monitor as though it might somehow explain things. Her voice dropped, quieter now. By your standards, I am indebted to you. Alan blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Indebted? I'm not exactly running a tab here. You don't understand, she said firmly, sitting up straighter despite her obvious discomfort. Among my people, a life saved is a bond forged. A debt paid only through equal sacrifice. Well, that sounds like a lot of paperwork, Alan quipped, hoping to cut through the tension. She didn't laugh. Instead, her expression turned serious, even solemn. This is no trivial matter. You have bound me to you. Rejecting such a bond would bring dishonor upon my lineage. Alan stared at her, trying to process the sheer absurdity of her words. Dishonor, he repeated. Lady, I think you've got the wrong guy. I'm just a pilot, not some cosmic life debt collector. Her expression hardened again. I'm not, lady. My name is Teresa Sauvon, diplomat of the Zenthari Empire. She spoke with a quiet pride, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. And you are Alan Cross. Human. He frowned. How do you know my name? Your ship systems identify you with each transmission, she replied, her tone matter of fact. You are not particularly discreet. Alan rubbed the back of his neck, muttering something under his breath about invasive alien tech. All right, Teresa, he said, leaning against the wall. What were you doing on Mars? Because I'm guessing you didn't come here for the scenery. Teresa's gaze flicked downward, her expression briefly clouded. My mission was to mediate a dispute between two factions on Zenthari-occupied moons. Our shuttle was en route when we were attacked. Attacked? Alan straightened. By who? I don't know, she admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. Pirates? Rebels? A rival empire? All I know is that they disabled our ship before we could identify them. I activated an escape pod, but the shuttle systems were already failing. That's how I ended up here. Alan mulled over her words, his mind racing. Whoever had attacked her was well-armed and had likely tracked her shuttle's crash. If they found her alive on his ship, things could get ugly. You think they'll come looking for you? He asked. Teresa's gaze met his, sharp and unyielding. They won't stop until they're certain I'm dead. Alan let out a low whistle. Great. Guess I signed up for more than just a rescue mission. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. The weight of the situation hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. After a long pause, Teresa broke the silence. Why did you really save me? Alan frowned. I told you. It's just what we do. That's not an answer, she said, her tone almost accusatory. You risked yourself, your resources, and possibly your safety for a stranger. No one does that without reason. Alan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he said, maybe I've seen enough people die to know I don't want to see any more. Does that work for you? Teresa studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, as if accepting his answer, though the look in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Alan pushed off the wall, breaking the tension. All right, diplomat, he said with a faint smirk. You're stable for now, but we've got work to do. If whoever hit your ship is still out there, we need to be ready. Teresa inclined her head. Agreed. And Alan? Yeah, thank you. Alan paused, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He nodded once, then turned and left the med bay, leaving Teresa alone with her thoughts. Alan Cross had just begun to relax in the cockpit, his feet propped on the console, sipping the last of his synthetic coffee. The ship hummed softly, a sound he found soothing after the chaos of the day. But the stillness didn't last long. From the med bay, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. I will fulfill the life debt. Teresa's voice rang out, firm and unyielding. Alan frowned and set the mug down with a clatter. He made his way toward the source of the noise, his boots echoing on the ship's metal floor. When he reached the med bay, the scene before him stopped him cold. Teresa stood in the center of the room, speaking with someone through a holographic transmission. Her silver hair caught the flickering blue light of the comm feed, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. The figure on the other end was a blur of static, their features indistinct, but their tone was clear, dismissive, almost condescending. Your survival is sufficient repayment, the voice said. The life debt is unnecessary. Teresa squared her shoulders, her violet skin catching the med bay's sterile light. You know that is not how it works. To ignore this obligation would bring dishonor to my family, my name, and my lineage. Alan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Dishonor? Huh? Sounds serious. Teresa spun to face him, her iridescent eyes narrowing. With a swift motion, she ended the transmission, and the holographic figure vanished. She stood tall, her posture rigid and formal. You were eavesdropping, she accused, Her melodic voice edged with irritation. You were shouting, Alan shot back, his tone dry. Care to explain what that was about? And don't say it's nothing, because it sure didn't sound like nothing. Teresa hesitated, her gaze shifting to the floor. For a moment, she seemed unsure of herself, but then her chin lifted, and she looked him square in the eye. Among my people, when one life is saved by another, a bond is formed. This bond is called the life debt. Okay, Alan said, waving his hand for her to continue. And that means what, exactly? She sighed, her voice softening. The life debt is an ancient tradition. It binds the savior and the saved in a lifelong commitment. It is unbreakable. Alan raised an eyebrow. A lifelong commitment? You mean like marriage? Yes, she said simply, her tone carrying a weight that silenced his instinct to joke. It is not just a tradition, it is law. By saving me, you have become bound to me. Alan blinked, his brain trying to process the enormity of her words. He shook his head. That's insane. I didn't agree to anything like that. I just pulled you out of a wreckage. In doing so, you assumed responsibility for my life, Teresa replied, her voice as calm as if she were explaining basic arithmetic. It is a sacred bond. Look, Alan began, pacing the room. I get that this is important to you, but where I come from, saving someone doesn't come with strings attached. We just do it. No contracts. No lifelong obligations. That is your way, Teresa said, her tone tinged with mild disdain. But my people do not view life so casually. To refuse the bond would bring dishonor upon my lineage. My family's name would be erased from the archives. I would become a disgrace. Alan stopped pacing, frowning. Erased? That's a bit extreme. Don't you think? It is how we preserve the integrity of our culture, Teresa said, crossing her arms. Without honor, there is no identity. Alan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I get that this is important to you, but I can't just marry you because your laws say so. Do you not understand the gravity of what you have done? Teresa stepped closer, her iridescent eyes gleaming with frustration. You saved my life, and now you refuse to take responsibility for it. Is this how humans treat their obligations? Alan held her gaze, his voice steady but firm. I didn't save you because I wanted something in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's all. Teresa tilted her head, studying him. For a moment, her expression softened. You act without expectation. It is strange, admirable, but strange. Well, thank you, Alan said, the sarcasm in his tone barely masked. Glad to know I've impressed you. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension in the room palpable. Finally, Teresa spoke again, her voice quieter now. There must be a compromise. Alan frowned. A compromise? Yes, she said, nodding. If you cannot accept the bond as my people do, then we must find another way to honor it. A trial period, perhaps? A trial period? Alan repeated, skeptical. What, like we date? Date? Teresa asked, her expression puzzled. I do not understand. Alan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It means we take it slow, get to know each other, see if this whole bond thing is even workable. Teresa considered this, her gaze thoughtful. Very well, she said finally. A trial period. But you must understand, Alan Cross, this is not merely an experiment. This is my honor, my name, my family. It is everything. Alan nodded, though he still wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. All right, we'll give it a shot. But no pressure, okay. Teresa's lips curved into a faint smile, the first genuine one he'd seen. Your methods are unconventional, but perhaps they hold merit. Alan couldn't help but smile back. You're not so bad yourself, Teresa. As he turned to leave, a thought struck him. By the way, your people wouldn't happen to have a way of tracking you, would they? Teresa's smile faded. If they do, we will know soon enough. Alan's stomach twisted at the ominous answer. He nodded, his expression grim. Great. Just what I needed. As he left the med bay, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something far bigger than himself. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. But then again, Alan Cross had never been one to take the easy way out. Alan Cross wasn't sure what he expected when Teresa suggested a trial period to honor her life debt, but it definitely wasn't this. The alien woman had commandeered his cargo hold and transformed it into what could only be described as a ceremonial space. Crystals, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, lined the edges of the room, and intricate symbols were etched into the floor in a chalky white material that Alan hoped wasn't toxic. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Teresa kneel before the largest crystal in the center. Her silver hair fell over her shoulders, catching the light like spun metal. She held her hands over the crystal, her lips moving silently, as if in prayer. "I feel like I should be worried," Alan said finally, breaking the silence. Teresa opened her eyes and glanced at him, her expression calm but firm. "This is a purification ritual. It is necessary before we proceed." "Proceed with what?" Alan asked, stepping into the room. "I thought this was supposed to be a trial period. You know, casual. No giant, glowing rocks involved." Teresa stood, her movements graceful despite the injuries she had endured. She turned to face him, her iridescent eyes shimmering in the low light. "To you, this is casual. To me, it is a matter of honor and survival. I cannot approach this bond with anything less than complete sincerity." Alan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, fine. Do your thing. Just don't summon any space demons, okay?" Teresa tilted her head, confused. "Demons? Never mind," Alan muttered, leaning against the wall. "So, what's next?" She gestured for him to sit across from her on the floor, and reluctantly he complied. The surface was cold, and the strange symbol seemed to hum faintly under his weight. He tried not to think about it. "This trial period," Teresa began, folding her hands in her lap, "is not merely a test of compatibility. It is a merging of cultures, an opportunity to bridge the gap between us." Alan raised an eyebrow. "Bridge the gap? Between humans and Zenthari?" "Yes," Teresa said. "By observing your ways and sharing mine, we may find common ground." Alan smirked. "So what? You want me to teach you how to play poker and eat processed junk food?" Teresa frowned. "Poker? It's a card game. You know what? Forget it," Alan said, shaking his head. "What do you want to do then?" Teresa picked up a small, smooth stone from beside her and held it out to him. "This is a Zenthari bonding stone. It represents unity. Each of us will inscribe it with a symbol that reflects our intentions." Alan stared at the stone, unimpressed. "You want me to carve something into this rock? That's your big idea?" "It is a symbolic act," Teresa said, her tone patient but firm. "Your symbol represents your commitment to understanding, however tentative. My symbol represents my gratitude and respect." Alan sighed, but took the stone. "Fine. Got a chisel or something?" Teresa handed him a small, glowing tool that looked like a pen. Alan clicked it experimentally, watching a sharp beam of light extend from the tip. "Laser etching," he muttered, vaguely impressed. He sat in silence for a moment, thinking about what to carve. Finally, he etched a simple circle into the stone. Teresa watched him, her expression curious. "A circle?" she asked. "Yeah," Alan said, handing the stone back to her. "It's simple. No beginning, no end. Just keeps going." Teresa examined it, then nodded in approval. "A wise choice." She took the laser tool and etched her own symbol into the stone, a series of interlocking triangles that seemed to shimmer as they caught the light. When she finished, she placed the stone between them, her expression serene. "Now we meditate," she said. Alan blinked. "We what?" "Meditate," Teresa repeated. "It is an essential part of the bonding process." "Great," Alan muttered. "Can't wait." Despite his grumbling, Alan closed his eyes and did his best to follow her lead. For a while, the only sound was the gentle hum of the crystals and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Against his better judgment, Alan found himself relaxing. The tension in his shoulders eased, and his thoughts grew quieter. Then the ship's alarms blared, shattering the peace like a hammer through glass. Alan was on his feet in an instant, sprinting toward the cockpit. Teresa followed close behind, her calm demeanor replaced by sharp focus. When they reached the control panel, Alan scanned the readouts, his stomach sinking. Multiple heat signatures, he said, his voice grim. Looks like someone's tracking us. Teresa leaned over his shoulder, her iridescent eyes scanning the data. Those are not human signatures, she said. They're Zenthari. Alan turned to her, his expression incredulous. Your people? I thought you said they wouldn't come looking for you. I said they might, Teresa corrected, her tone clipped. It appears they have. Alan's mind raced as he checked the ship's systems. They're gaining on us. I don't have the firepower to take on a Zenthari ship. Teresa placed a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You must trust me. Trust you? They're here because of you, Alan snapped, then immediately regretted it when he saw the flash of hurt in her expression. They are here because of what I carry, she said, her voice low but steady. They believe I possess information that could alter the balance of power in the galaxy. That is why they attacked my shuttle. Alan stared at her, his frustration giving way to a mix of curiosity and unease. What kind of information? Teresa hesitated, then said, the truth about our leaders. About the corruption at the heart of the Zenthari Empire. Alan exhaled, his mind reeling. So, you're not just a diplomat. You're a whistleblower. Teresa nodded. I did not expect my actions to bring harm to others. For that, I am sorry. Alan looked at her, then at the blaring console. Sorry doesn't help us outrun a warship. No, Teresa agreed. But strategy does. She leaned over the controls, her fingers flying across the panel. Within seconds, the ship's trajectory shifted, veering toward a canyon on Mars' surface. What are you doing? Alan demanded. Hiding, Teresa said simply. Trust me, Alan Cross. Your ship may not be powerful, but it is agile, and I have no intention of being caught. Alan hesitated, then nodded. All right, Teresa, let's see what you've got. As the ship dove toward the canyon, Alan couldn't help but think that this trial period was shaping up to be a lot more exciting and dangerous than he had anticipated. The ship's cockpit dimmed as Alan Cross brought the vessel to a halt, settling it deep within the jagged fissure they had found. The engines hissed as they cooled, the silence of Mars Canyon swallowing them whole. Alan leaned back in his seat, his breathing unsteady as the realization of their close escape settled over him. He glanced at the monitor. The Zenthari ship was still there, circling like a predator just out of reach. You've got their attention, Alan muttered, swiveling his chair to face Teresa. Teresa stood behind him, her violet skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Her expression remained calm, though her iridescent eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Their persistence is unsurprising, she said, crossing her arms. They fear what I know. Alan raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. So, what exactly do you know that's worth getting us killed? Teresa hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment before she answered. The Zenthari Empire thrives on control, of resources, of people, of information. I learned the truth behind their expansion, the alliances they broke, the innocence they exploited. I thought I could change it from within, but I underestimated their willingness to silence dissent. Alan frowned. And now they want you dead. Not just me, Teresa said quietly. They will destroy anyone who aids me, including you. Alan waved a hand dismissively. Yeah, I got that part. Thanks for the heads up. The tension in the room thickened. Alan turned back to the monitor, staring at the blip that represented the Zenthari warship. Its movement had slowed, almost as if it were scanning the area. They'll find us eventually, he said, his voice low. Even with the dead zone messing with their systems, they'll figure out a way to flush us out. Teresa stepped closer, her tone resolute. Then we must act first. Alan spun his chair around, staring at her incredulously. Act first? Against them? Did you miss the part where they've got a ship that could turn this canyon into a crater? I am aware of the risks, Teresa said sharply, her calm demeanor cracking just slightly. But we have resources they lack. Alan gestured around the cockpit. Resources? You mean this rust bucket and whatever scraps I've got in storage? Precisely, Teresa replied, her confidence unwavering. They expect power and brute force. They do not expect ingenuity. Alan sighed, rubbing his temples. Orat, Genus? What's the plan? Teresa motioned for him to follow her. leading him to the cargo hold. The space was cramped, filled with crates of spare parts, outdated tools, and a handful of supplies Alan had scavenged over the years. Teresa began rummaging through the mess, her movements purposeful. "Your atmosphere canisters," she said, pulling one from a crate. "They contain pressurized oxygen and nitrogen, yes?" Alan nodded. "Yeah, for emergencies." "Why?" "We can use them to create an explosive diversion," Teresa explained, setting the canister aside. "If we place the charges strategically, we can collapse part of the canyon and force their ship to retreat." Alan folded his arms. "You're suggesting we blow up the canyon while we're still in it? That's your big plan?" Teresa straightened, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "It is not ideal, but it is necessary. Do you have a better idea?" Alan opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. She had a point. Without heavier weaponry or reinforcements, their options were limited. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "Let's do it. But if this goes sideways, I'm blaming you." Teresa allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Noted." They worked quickly, their movements efficient despite the tension. Alan showed Teresa how to rig the canisters with detonators, while she marked key points in the canyon where the explosions would have the most impact. As they set the charges, the silence of the canyon pressed down on them, broken only by the distant hum of the Zenthary's ship overhead. "You've done this before," Alan said, his voice breaking the quiet. "Not precisely," Teresa replied without looking up. "But I have studied tactical strategy extensively." Alan smirked. "Figures. You've got the whole ice-cold strategist vibe down." Teresa paused, glancing at him. "And you have the demeanor of someone who hides fear with humor." Alan blinked, caught off guard. "Wow, didn't realize we were psychoanalyzing each other now." "Observation is a valuable skill," Teresa said simply, returning to her work. They finished placing the charges just as the Zenthary's ship's low hum grew louder. Alan checked the monitor on his wrist. "They're moving closer. We're out of time." Teresa nodded. "Return to the ship. I will detonate the charges remotely." Alan hesitated. "You sure you don't want me to handle that?" Teresa's expression softened slightly. "I trust you to keep us alive, Alan Cross. Trust me to do the same." Something about the way she said his name made Alan's chest tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. "All right, just don't take too long." He climbed back into the ship, his fingers flying across the controls to prepare for takeoff. The Zenthary vessel loomed on the monitor, its sensors probing the area with increasing precision. Alan clenched his jaw, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come on, Teresa," he muttered under his breath. Finally, she appeared in the airlock, her movements swift but controlled. She closed the hatch and joined him in the cockpit. "The charges are armed. We must move." Alan didn't need to be told twice. He fired up the engines, the ship shuddering as it lifted off the canyon floor. The Zenthary vessel immediately reacted, moving to intercept them. Teresa activated the detonator, and a series of deafening explosions echoed through the canyon. Rocks and debris rained down, engulfing the Zenthary ship in a cloud of dust and chaos. Alan guided the ship out of the canyon, the turbulence rattling every bolt in the hull. When they finally broke free, the monitor showed no sign of pursuit. The Zenthary ship was gone, buried beneath the rubble. Alan exhaled, his hands trembling slightly as he let go of the controls. "Well, that was a hell of a gamble." Teresa sat beside him, her expression calm, but her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "It was necessary." Alan glanced at her, a grudging respect forming in his mind. "You're full of surprises, you know that? And you are full of doubt," Teresa replied, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. Alan chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair enough. Let's just hope your empire doesn't have a backup plan." Teresa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out the viewport, her gaze distant. "If they do, we will face it. Together." Alan nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. For the first time, he felt like they might actually stand a chance. The silence after their escape felt oppressive. Alan Cross stared at the cockpit monitor, half expecting the Zenthary blip to reappear. The ship's hum filled the air as they cruised through the Martian twilight, the landscape below bathed in a dim, burnt orange glow. His grip on the controls loosened slightly, but the tension in his shoulders remained. He glanced at Teresa. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her expression calm but distant. Her violet skin seemed almost luminescent in the dim light, and her iridescent eyes flicked between the monitors and the horizon. For someone who had just orchestrated the destruction of a canyon to escape a warship, she looked unervingly composed. "All right," Alan said, breaking the silence. "We're clear for now. You want to tell me what's next, or are we just winging it?" Teresa tilted her head, studying him. "Winging it," Alan rolled his eyes. "Improvising. Playing it by ear. Making it up as we go." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Ah yes, a hallmark of human behavior." "Glad I could impress you," Alan muttered, leaning back in his chair. "But seriously, we need a plan. Your people aren't just going to give up." Teresa's smile faded. "No, they will not." She turned her gaze to the viewport, her voice quieter now. "The Zenthri Empire does not tolerate dissent. Their reach extends far beyond this planet. We are not safe." Alan sighed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Then why run to Mars in the first place? If they've got eyes everywhere, this was a terrible place to hide. Teresa met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "I did not choose Mars as a refuge. My shuttle was struck in orbit. I ejected before the ship was destroyed." Alan blinked, his annoyance softening. "So you were never supposed to come here?" "No," Teresa said. "But perhaps there is a reason I did." Alan leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You're one for fate, huh?" "Not fate," Teresa said, "but opportunity." Alan snorted. "Not sure how much opportunity you'll find on a barren rock." Teresa's gaze lingered on him, her expression inscrutable. "Perhaps more than you think." Before Alan could respond, the ship's proximity alarm blared, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet. He shot upright, his eyes darting to the monitor. A new blip appeared, closing in fast. "Tell me that's not another Zenthri ship," Alan muttered, flipping switches on the console. The sensor readout updated, displaying the outline of a small craft. It wasn't Zenthri. It wasn't even alien. "It's human," Alan said, his brow furrowing. "Probably one of the Martian salvage teams." Teresa stood, her posture tense. "They may not be friendly." "Relax," Alan said, though his tone lacked confidence. "They're just scavengers. They'll probably leave us alone if we don't look like an easy mark." The comm crackled to life, and a gruff voice filled the cockpit. "Unidentified vessel. This is salvage crew Theta 7. Your transponder shows heavy damage and recent weapons discharge. Power down and prepare for inspection." Alan groaned. "Because that's not suspicious at all." Teresa frowned. "Can we evade them?" "Not without raising more questions," Alan said, switching the comm channel. "Theta 7, this is Captain Cross of the Orion. No cargo, no contraband. Just passing through." The voice on the other end chuckled darkly. "Funny. You look like you've been in a fight, Captain. Power down, or we'll take that ship apart piece by piece." Alan muttered a curse under his breath. "They're bluffing. They don't have the firepower." "They may not need it," Teresa said. "They have us cornered." Alan glanced at her. "You're awfully calm for someone who might get shot out of the sky." Teresa's expression didn't change. "Panicking will not help. Surviving will." "Great advice," Alan said, switching back to the comm. "All right, Theta 7, we're powering down. But if you're looking for something valuable, you're wasting your time." The salvage craft docked with the Orion, the clang of the airlock echoing through the ship. Alan stood by the hatch, his pulse rifle slung over his shoulder. Teresa remained at his side, her posture composed but ready. The hatch opened, revealing 3 men in patched-up suits. Their leader, a burly man with a scar running across his jaw, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Alan and Teresa. "Quite the pair you've got here," the man said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Mind explaining why your ship looks like it just crawled out of a war zone?" "Ran into some trouble with a Zenthri patrol," Alan said casually. "Barely got away." The man's gaze lingered on Teresa. "And her? She one of them?" Alan stepped forward, blocking the man's view. "She's with me. You got your explanation. Now, how about you tell me what you're really after?" The man smirked. "Fair enough. Zenthry tech fetches a good price. Thought you might have some scraps worth taking. Alan folded his arms. Sorry to disappoint. The man's smirk faltered, and he gestured to one of his crew. Search the ship. Alan's hand tightened on his rifle, but before he could act, Teresa spoke. Wait. Everyone turned to her. She stepped forward, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. You are scavengers, yes? Interested in profit? The leader raised an eyebrow. You offering something? Teresa reached into a compartment on her suit and pulled out a small, crystalline device. It glowed faintly, casting fractured light across the room. This is a Zenthry data crystal. It contains encrypted navigation logs from one of their warships. Sell it to the right buyer, and you will earn far more than you would from stripping this vessel. The man's eyes widened, greed flickering across his face. That's real? Yes, Teresa said, but you must leave us untouched. That is the condition. Alan stared at her, stunned. You're just giving that away? Teresa glanced at him, her voice steady. We will not survive without compromise. The man snatched the crystal from her hand, his suspicion momentarily overcome by greed. Deal. Without another word, the scavengers retreated to their ship. Alan waited until they were gone before turning to Teresa. You had that the whole time? It was a risk to use it, she admitted, but a necessary one. Alan shook his head, a mix of frustration and admiration bubbling inside him. You're something else, you know that? Teresa's lips curved into the faintest smile. So I'd been told, as they powered up the ship and prepared to leave Mars behind. Alan couldn't help but feel that their troubles were far from over. But for the first time, he also felt something else, a sliver of hope. The stars stretched infinitely as the Orion cut through the quiet void, leaving the red sands of Mars behind. Alan Cross leaned back in the pilot's chair, staring out at the expanse with a weary but satisfied sigh. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. The tension in his shoulders eased, but his mind remained restless. Behind him, Teresa stood by the observation panel, her iridescent eyes fixed on the swirling patterns of distant galaxies. Her usual stoicism was still there, but something had softened in her demeanor. The faint glow of the console lights danced across her violet skin, giving her an almost ethereal quality. Alan cleared his throat. You've been quiet. Teresa turned to him, her expression calm but thoughtful. Silence is necessary for reflection. Alan raised an eyebrow. Reflecting on what? On survival. On choices, Teresa said, stepping closer. On the bonds forged through adversity. Alan snorted, running a hand through his hair. You mean this whole life-debt thing? Teresa tilted her head, studying him with an inscrutable gaze. The life debt is more than tradition. It is a recognition of shared struggle, a bond formed not through obligation, but understanding. Understanding, huh? Alan leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. All right then, what exactly have you come to understand about me? Teresa's lips curved into a faint smile. That you act without expectation of reward. That you care more deeply than you admit. And that your humor, though often ill-timed, is a shield you use to hide your fear. Alan blinked, caught off guard by her insight. Well, thanks for the free therapy session. Her smile widened slightly, the closest he had ever seen her come to a grin. You are difficult to read, Alan Cross, but not impossible. And what about you? Alan asked, shifting the conversation. You're not exactly an open book yourself. Teresa's expression grew serious. I have learned that strength is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. You have taught me that. Alan chuckled, though his voice was softer now. Guess we've both been learning. They fell into a comfortable silence, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. Alan glanced at the monitor, confirming their course. The ship was heading toward a neutral station on the edge of human-controlled space, a place where they could lay low, resupply, and figure out their next move. You think they'll keep coming for you? Alan asked. The Zenthry? Teresa nodded. It is likely. The information I carry threatens their control. They will not stop until it is erased. Alan frowned, his fingers tapping absently on the console. And what about this trial period? The whole life debt thing? Where does that leave us? Teresa stepped closer, her gaze steady. The trial was meant to determine if our bond could transcend obligation. I believe it has. Alan looked up at her, his usual smirk replaced by something more genuine. So, what does that mean? For us? Teresa hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt both intimate and formal. It means you are no longer simply my savior. You are my partner. The weight of her words settled over him, heavier than he expected. Alan nodded slowly, his voice quiet. Partner, huh? I think I can live with that. As the station came into view, Alan adjusted their trajectory, preparing for docking. All right, partner. What's the plan? Hide out and hope the Zenthari forget about us. No, Teresa said firmly. We take the fight to them. Alan raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. It is necessary, Teresa replied. The Zenthari thrive on fear and secrecy. Exposing their corruption is the only way to weaken their hold. Alan leaned back, letting out a low whistle. That's a tall order. You sure you're ready for that? I am, Teresa said, her voice steady. But I cannot do it alone. Alan looked at her, and for a moment, the weight of their journey, the battles, the close calls, the sacrifices, was written on his face. He nodded, a small but resolute smile forming. Well, I did say I'd stick around. Guess I'm all in. Teresa inclined her head, her expression softening. Then we face what comes together. The Orion docked smoothly, the lights of the station reflecting off its weathered hull. As Alan powered down the ship, he glanced at Teresa one last time. For what it's worth, I'm glad you crash-landed on Mars. Teresa raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her voice. Even if it brought chaos to your life? Especially because of that, Alan said with a grin. Chaos keeps things interesting. Teresa gave a small, almost imperceptible laugh, and for the first time, Alan saw a side of her that felt wholly human, vulnerable, yet resilient. Together, they stepped off the ship and into the station, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Their bond, forged in survival and tempered by trust, was no longer just a product of tradition or duty. It was something more, something earned, and as they walked into the unknown, side by side, Alan felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The stars outside the Orion stretched into streaks of silver as the ship slipped into hyperspace. Alan Cross adjusted the navigation panel, his movements slower and more deliberate than usual. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape from Mars had ebbed, leaving him with a restless energy he couldn't quite shake. He glanced over his shoulder, where Teresa stood at the viewport, bathed in the faint light of the controls. Her violet skin shimmered faintly, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders like strands of liquid light. You've been quiet, Alan said, leaning back in his chair. Teresa turned to face him, her iridescent eyes reflecting the ambient glow of the cockpit. There is much to reflect upon. Alan smirked. Let me guess. Honor, duty, tradition? You mock, Teresa replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But you are not entirely wrong. Our bond is complicated. Alan stood, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. You mean the life-death thing? I thought we were working past all that. We are, Teresa said, stepping closer. But among my people, bonds forged in survival are sacred. They transcend mere obligation. Alan tilted his head, studying her. Sounds a lot like you're still talking about marriage. Teresa's expression didn't waver. Because I am. Alan blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of her statement. Wait, seriously? After everything we've been through, you're still hung up on that? It is not a question of being hung up, Teresa said, her tone calm but firm. Our bond has already been tested and proven. It is not obligation that binds us now, Alan Cross. It is choice. Alan opened his mouth to respond but stopped, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought back to every moment they had shared, their narrow escapes, the countless times they had saved each other, and the quiet conversations during the rare lulls in danger. Somewhere along the way, what had started as an impossible situation had become something he couldn't imagine walking away from. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice quieter now. You're serious about this, aren't you? Teresa stepped closer, her iridescent eyes locked on his. I have never been more certain. Alan sighed, shaking his head with a half-smile. You're a stubborn one. You know that? I've been told, Teresa replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. For a moment, the cockpit was silent, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. Then Alan let out a breath and nodded. All right, let's do it. Let's make this official. Teresa's smile softened, and for the first time, Alan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. Are you certain? This is no small commitment. Alan stepped closer, his grin widening. Teresa, I've been running for most of my life from responsibilities, from people, from my own damn problems. Maybe it's time I stop. Teresa inclined her head, her voice quiet but steady. Then we will do this in the way of my people. The ship's cargo hold had been transformed into a makeshift ceremonial space, adorned with glowing crystals and intricate patterns drawn in chalky white across the floor. Teresa stood in the center, her ceremonial robes, silver and flowing like liquid metal, catching the light. Her iridescent eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and serenity. Alan, dressed in a simple jacket and shirt, stood opposite her. He felt a bit out of place in the alien grandeur of it all, but the look in Teresa's eyes grounded him. What do I do? He asked, his voice low. Teresa held out her hands, palms up. Place your hands over mine and speak your truth. Alan hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, placing his hands over hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, but it sent a warmth through him that was hard to describe. I don't know if I'm the guy you expected, Alan began, his voice soft but steady. Hell, I don't even know if I'm the guy you deserve. But I got your back, no matter what. That's my truth. Teresa's gaze didn't waver. And I will stand beside you, in honor and in trust. That is my truth. The crystals around them flared to life, their glow intensifying as the symbols on the floor shimmered. A faint hum filled the air, resonating in Alan's chest. Teresa stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. It is done. We are bound, Alan Cross. Not by obligation, but by choice. Alan grinned, his usual sarcasm giving way to something genuine. Well, here's to a lifetime of bad decisions. Teresa laughed softly, a sound Alan realized he wanted to hear more often. Later, as the Orion cruised through the vastness of space, Alan and Teresa stood together at the viewport, watching the stars streak past. So, what now? Alan asked, his tone lighter. Teresa glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Now we fight. Together. Alan nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. Together, huh? I think I can get used to that. Teresa tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. So can I. And as they stood side by side, the endless void stretching before them, Alan felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose and the certainty that he wasn't facing the unknown alone. Their bond, sealed in survival and strengthened by choice, was now unbreakable.